Today, we are getting into one of the most important and honestly one of the most complicated laws in Native American history, the Indian Organization Act. It was a law that was really born from a desire to fix past wrongs. But as you're about to see, the road from good intentions to actual results is, well, it's almost never a straight line. And that really is the question at the heart of this whole story, isn't it? How can something that starts with a noble goal end up causing so much pain? It's a question that you see all throughout history, but it feels especially sharp when you look at the US government's relationship with Native peoples, where so many attempts to help actually ended in disaster. All right, so let's jump right in with a story that just perfectly captures this paradox. We're in the 1930s. The US government is looking at Navajo land, and they see a big problem that they think they need to fix. The thing is, their solution, it would become an absolute catastrophe. So the official in charge, a man named John Collier, he saw a very real environmental problem. Overgrazing was leading to serious soil erosion. And to him, the solution seemed pretty logical. Just get rid of a lot of the livestock. But for the Navajo, these animals weren't just livestock. I mean, this was their bank account, their food supply, their entire culture was woven around these herds. And now the government was ordering them to be slaughtered. This one act, it just carved this deep, lasting wound of mistrust that would poison everything that came next. But that Navajo disaster, it didn't just happen out of nowhere. It was really a symptom of a much bigger, decades-long policy failure that the government was only just starting to wake up to. So to really understand the new plan they came up with, we have to look at the old one that went so wrong. So this whole mess really kicks off about 40 years earlier with something called the Dawes Act of 1887. The official policy was allotment. And the idea was to break up the communal lands that tribes held together, give these small individual plots to Native families, and basically force them to become American-style farmers and assimilate. But by the 1910s, it was painfully obvious the whole thing was a complete disaster, which led to a huge government investigation. And that investigation led to the Merriam Report. And let me tell you, it was an absolute bombshell. For the first time in 800 pretty excruciating pages, the US government officially admitted that its own policies were systematically destroying Native American lives. It was just this stunning, totally unprecedented confession of failure. And the scale of that failure was just devastating. Instead of creating all these self-sufficient farmers, the policy had created absolute crushing poverty. The report found that the average income for a Native American was the equivalent of just $1,500 a year in today's money. Now, for comparison, the average American at that exact same time was making over $21,000 in today's money. This wasn't just a gap, it was a chasm. And it was a chasm that was literally engineered by federal policy. And it got so much worse. The report detailed these horrific conditions in healthcare facilities where diseases like tuberculosis were just running wild. It exposed the Native boarding schools as these overcrowded, awful places where malnourished children were being forced into hard labor instead of getting an education. The picture it painted was just unbelievably bleak, and you just couldn't deny it. So, faced with this mountain of damning evidence, the government knew it had to do something completely different. And this led to what's often called the Indian New Deal, a really radical attempt to just slam on the brakes and reverse course. And the heart of this new approach was the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. Now think about this. After a century of policies designed to either wipe out or water down Native culture, this was the first law that had the stated goal of actually strengthening it. It was like the government was playing an Uno reverse card on decades of its own terrible policy. This phrase, right from the law, is absolutely key. The IRA recognized that tribes could govern themselves not because the US was giving them permission, but because of their original tribal sovereignty. In other words, it was an acknowledgement that this right was inherent, that it existed long before the United States ever did. That's a massive philosophical shift. So, what did it actually promise to do? Well, it was a direct answer to everything the Merriam Report had condemned. First, end the disastrous allotment policy. Second, encourage tribes to form their own governments. Third, conserve native lands. And fourth, set up a credit system to fight the very poverty that the old policies had created. On paper, it looked like a perfect solution. But, and this is where the story gets really complicated, this law, which seemed so progressive, was met with deep suspicion, a ton of criticism, and in many cases, just outright rejection from the very people it was supposed to help. So a vote was held, and the results were messy. You had over 160 tribes that voted to accept the IRA, but 77 voted against it. But look closer. The most telling number might be that 60%. Roughly 60% of eligible Native Americans didn't vote at all. And because of that widespread apathy and distrust, many of these new tribal governments were formed without a real majority vote from their people, which was a huge problem right from the get-go. So why didn't people vote? Well, one of the biggest reasons was a fundamental clash of cultures. The IRA was pushing tribes to adopt American-style constitutions with majority rule voting. But for many tribes, like the Ojibwe, for example, traditional governance was based on consensus. Everybody had to agree before you moved forward. The IRA's focus on speed and efficiency just felt totally alien and really disruptive. And the criticisms just kept piling up, which is how it earned the nickname the Indian Raw Deal. First, there was that deep distrust of the government, and especially of John Collier, remember, the same guy behind the Navajo livestock slaughter. The act also kept a lot of power in federal hands, like a kind of paternalistic oversight. And on top of all that, its programs were just chronically underfunded, and it was a one-size-fits-all solution being forced onto hundreds of unique, incredibly diverse tribes. And this chart, this just shows one of the IRA's biggest failures in really stark terms. During that allotment era, tribes lost 90 million acres of land. The IRA, with all of its promises, only managed to get about 2 million of those acres back. It was barely a drop in the bucket compared to what had been taken away. So, what do we make of all this? What's the legacy of this completely paradoxical law? Well, the most incredible thing is, we're not just talking about history here. The IRA is still actively shaping Native American life today. And its impact has been just wildly different depending on where you look. Take the Ute tribes, for example. They used the IRA to buy back resource-rich land, and they've had a lot of economic success, though many would argue it came at a great cultural cost. And then you have the Navajo Nation. Still scarred by that livestock slaughter, they rejected the act. And now, almost 90 years later, they're still debating the very structure of their government. There is no single story of how the IRA turned out. And I just want to let that sink in for a second. This first attempt, this flawed, controversial, revolutionary piece of legislation from 1934, with all of its successes and all of its many failures, is still in effect. It is still the foundational law governing the relationship between the U.S. and many tribal nations. Which leaves us with a final and really challenging thought. The story of the IRA shows that even a well-intentioned effort to fix historical trauma can end up creating brand new problems. It forces us to ask, how do you even begin to repair a relationship that's been broken by centuries of trauma, when the very first step forward is itself so complicated and so flawed? It's a huge question with no easy answers, but it's one we absolutely have to keep asking.